This man was a pilot, but little did anyone know that he would go down in history as the most prolific drug smuggler America had ever seen. He managed to traffic narcotics worth an astonishing $20 billion. What's even more shocking, this man didn't fit the typical image of a smuggler. His life was far from what one would expect of a criminal. On the surface, he was a successful businessman, the owner of a thriving company, and a man who built genuine relationships with politicians and influential figures. So, how did a man like him manage to run a massive drug trafficking operation right under everyone's noses without raising suspicion? And here's something even crazier. He continued smuggling drugs even during his own trial. While he sat in court listening to discussions about his smuggling charges, he was still making deals. And astonishingly, no one caught him. In the end, he was acquitted of all charges. Join us as we dive into the extraordinary, true story of the biggest drug trafficker in American history. Our story takes place in 1983, at the peak of the 1980s drug epidemic, when drug smuggling into the U.S. was at an all-time high. The trade was dominated by Colombian drug cartels, with none other than the notorious Medellín Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar at the forefront. These cartels recruited countless American citizens to serve as accomplices in their smuggling operations. But as the drug trade flourished, the U.S. government fought back. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, intensified its efforts, launching an all-out war against the smugglers. American traffickers would fly their small private planes to Colombia, load up with drugs, and then fly back to the U.S., delivering their illicit cargo. Once inside the country, the drugs were distributed through vast criminal networks, flooding American streets. Florida became the epicenter of the drug trade, the primary gateway for smuggled narcotics. Its close proximity to Colombia made it the most strategic entry point. However, the small planes used by the smugglers had limited fuel capacity, meaning they had to take the shortest route possible, a direct path between Florida and Colombia. The DEA quickly caught on. They closely monitored the smugglers and started noticing a pattern. Many of them wore gold chains, expensive watches, and similar flashy outfits, an unspoken uniform among traffickers. By profiling them, the DEA successfully identified and arrested many smugglers. In fact, Florida had more DEA operatives than any other region in the U.S. To strengthen their efforts, the DEA built a massive surveillance network, incorporating ground-based radar systems and aerial surveillance planes that patrolled the skies 24/7. Even the U.S. Navy joined the fight, deploying radar-equipped warships to monitor the coastal areas where smugglers operated. With their land, air, and sea networks in place, authorities made it increasingly difficult for traffickers to continue their operations. But in response, smugglers grew even more cunning, developing new strategies to stay ahead of law enforcement. Rather than immediately arresting smugglers upon discovery, the DEA implemented a different strategy. They allowed them to continue their operations, closely monitoring their activities to track the entire supply chain. This approach didn't just target the smugglers, it led them straight to the drug dealers operating within the country. By taking down both the smugglers and the dealers at the same time, authorities could seize not only the drugs but also the profits earned from the trade, dealing a devastating blow to the entire operation. Thanks to these relentless crackdowns, many smugglers were arrested, while others abandoned the trade entirely. But one man dared to challenge the system, a man who managed to smuggle a record-breaking amount of drugs, far surpassing any other trafficker in history. His shipments alone were worth billions. Using exceptionally clever methods, he was able to evade the extensive security and radar networks that had shut down countless others before him. The DEA knew he existed, but they couldn't track him down. Despite assembling a special pursuit force dedicated solely to catching him, he remained untouchable. His case became their highest priority because he wasn't just another smuggler. He was doing the work of an entire network all by himself. But who was this man? How did he pull off such an operation? And how did he manage to stay hidden for so long, despite being the DEA's most wanted target? The reason no one could find him was simple. They were searching in the wrong place. Unlike most smugglers, he wasn't operating out of Florida. And unlike the stereotypical trafficker, he didn't fit the profile at all. This man was Rick Lucius, a businessman and a seemingly law-abiding citizen living in Scranton, Pennsylvania. His life appeared so normal, so quiet, that no one could have imagined he was running a drug empire. What set Rick apart was his extraordinary aviation knowledge. He wasn't just a pilot. He was an aviation engineer of the highest caliber. Since childhood, he had been obsessed with aviation. Incredibly, he obtained his pilot's license while still in high school. From there, he attended aviation college, mastering both piloting and aircraft engineering. He became a true expert in the field. After graduating, Rick became a specialized professor in aviation, but soon he decided to take things further. He launched his own business, Air America, a company specializing in modifying small private aircraft. Rick's company focused on enhancing aircraft performance. He specialized in increasing fuel capacity, enabling planes to fly much longer distances without refueling. A plane that could originally only travel 1,000 kilometers could now fly twice that distance after modifications. Of course, these adjustments required additional structural reinforcements, such as strengthening the wings, engines, and landing gear. Under Rick's leadership, Air America became known for its precision and professionalism, gaining a strong reputation and bringing in substantial profits. His social status skyrocketed, and he found himself rubbing shoulders with powerful figures, police chiefs, state governors, and even the U.S. president. Rick attended elite events, forming valuable connections. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But then 1980 happened. A devastating economic crisis struck the world, hitting America especially hard. Rick's once thriving company began to struggle. Many of his regular clients disappeared, and in their place, a new type of customer emerged. These new customers were suspicious. They had shady connections and made strange requests, modifications to create hidden storage compartments inside their planes, designed to conceal cargo even from thorough searches. Rick quickly realized what was going on. These people were smugglers, but faced with financial ruin, he had no choice. He reluctantly agreed to work with them, and soon, Rick's company was no longer just modifying planes. It was playing a critical role in one of the biggest drug smuggling operations in history. Rick saw this as his golden opportunity, an easy way to inject much-needed cash into his struggling business. At first, he believed this would be a short-term gig, just enough to get back on his feet. But little did he know, he was stepping into a world that would change his life forever. The cartel members he worked with weren't just smugglers. They were also drug users, reckless and disorganized. Their planes were a mess. Extra fuel tanks were openly placed inside the cabin, and the drugs? Scattered carelessly, making every flight a disaster waiting to happen. The cartel's operations were based in Florida, a state crawling with DEA agents and radar systems scanning for suspicious aircraft. Despite these risks, Rick had a skill that made him invaluable. He could slip past detection like a ghost. His first smuggling run proved just how good he was. Flying between Pennsylvania and Colombia, he evaded radar and completed the journey flawlessly. The cartel was impressed. They paid him handsomely, enough to temporarily keep his business afloat. But after just 3 operations, Rick realized he was playing with fire. The risks were mounting, and the cartel's sloppy tactics were a liability. He decided to walk away, but he had already caught the attention of someone far more dangerous. Jorge Ochoa, one of the top figures in the Medellín Cartel and a close ally of Pablo Escobar himself, had heard about Rick's talent. Unlike the amateur smugglers Rick had previously worked with, Ochoa was the real deal, one of the masterminds behind the vast flow of cocaine into the U.S. When Ochoa personally reached out to Rick, it wasn't an invitation. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. Sitting across from Ochoa, Rick listened as the cartel leader laid out his vision. This wasn't small-time smuggling. This was an empire. And if Rick joined, he wouldn't just be another pilot. He would be a key player. The money, more than he ever dreamed. A life of wealth, power, and luxury. But there was a catch. Ochoa leaned in, his voice calm but firm. If you ever betray us, we will find you, and that will be the end of you. Rick knew what that meant. He had a choice. Walk away and struggle to keep his business alive, or take a risk and become part of the biggest drug operation in history. He chose the latter. But first, he needed the right plane. Rick got his hands on a Cessna 310, an aircraft he knew like the back of his hand. Its range was about 1,500 kilometers, not nearly enough for a direct flight to Colombia. That had to change. Using his engineering expertise, he increased the fuel capacity from 2,000 gallons to a staggering 6,000, tripling its range. But he had to be smart. DEA agents were already suspicious of planes overloaded with visible fuel tanks. His solution? Genius. Instead of storing fuel in obvious barrels inside the plane, he used flexible rubber fuel bags and hid them within the aircraft's structure. Beneath the flooring, inside the wings, in luggage compartments, every empty space was filled with fuel. He designed a custom distribution system to keep the weight balanced, preventing the plane from becoming unstable mid-flight. But fuel wasn't his only concern. Rick installed a radar detection system on board, allowing him to spot DEA aircraft before they spotted him. He also bribed a corrupt customs agent who provided him with valuable intel, radar locations, patrol schedules, and safe flight corridors. To communicate with the cartel, he set up a covert radio network using coded messages, eliminating the risk of intercepted phone calls. While secretly preparing for the biggest smuggling operation of his life, Rick maintained an elaborate cover. He kept close ties with the same DEA agents who had previously recruited him as an informant, pretending to be a cooperative businessman. He even fed them small bits of information about minor smugglers to keep their trust. They never suspected that, right under their noses, he was about to pull off a smuggling operation unlike anything they had ever seen. After 3 months of meticulous planning, Rick was ready. On the night of his first major mission, he took off from Pennsylvania, flying 5,000 kilometers to Colombia, non-stop. A grueling 13-hour journey. When he arrived, cartel workers were already waiting at a makeshift airstrip in the middle of nowhere. There was no real runway, just an open field. Within minutes, they loaded his plane with nearly a ton of cocaine, refueled him, and sent him back into the sky. Now came the hard part. Taking off from an uneven dirt strip, overloaded with cargo, was no easy task. A single miscalculation meant crashing into the trees at the runway's edge. But Rick had accounted for everything. The plane's weight, the runway length, even the precise moment to pull up. He powered forward, and just as he predicted, the aircraft lifted off smoothly, skimming past the treetops. But trouble was waiting for him in the air. Mid-flight, his radar picked up an unwelcome visitor, a U.S. Navy surveillance plane. If they locked onto him, it was game over. Rick had to think fast. Outrunning them was impossible. His only hope? Disappearing. Ahead, a massive thunderstorm loomed. It was risky, but he had no choice. He veered into the storm, banking hard as lightning crackled around him. The turbulence was brutal, the winds threatening to tear his aircraft apart. But there was one advantage. Radar signals couldn't penetrate the storm. If he could endure the chaos, he might just shake his pursuers. For 2 agonizing hours, Rick battled the storm, flying blind through sheets of rain and violent winds. And then, silence. He was in the clear. Emerging from the storm, he executed one final deception. Before heading home, he made a brief landing at an abandoned airstrip. The reason? To make it appear as if he had taken off from that location, covering up the fact that he had just arrived from Colombia. When he finally touched down in Scranton, everything was in place. His flight was logged as a routine domestic trip. No suspicions, no alarms. The cocaine was delivered, and in return, Rick pocketed a staggering $1 million. The cartel was beyond impressed. This wasn't just another smuggler. This was a professional, a mastermind, and they wanted more. With each trip, Rick smuggled hundreds of kilograms of cocaine, earning over $1 million per flight. The money flowed in faster than he could spend it, and soon he was drowning in wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But instead of slowing down, he expanded his operations. He formed his own specialized gang, recruited skilled pilots, and increased the number of flights under his command. Every aircraft was meticulously modified to maximize efficiency and evade detection. Rick personally oversaw every detail, ensuring perfection. As he mastered the game, caution took a back seat. The fear that once haunted him began to fade. The risks, still there, but Rick felt invincible. His operation had an unmatched track record, never losing a single plane, never getting caught. In an industry where smugglers regularly faced disastrous failures, Rick and his team remained untouchable. His precision and expertise left cartel leaders in awe, and they rewarded him beyond what was promised. He wasn't just another smuggler. He was a mastermind, making them richer than they had ever imagined. Despite his deep entanglement in the drug trade, Rick maintained his carefully crafted double life. His ties with DEA agents remained intact. They saw him as an informant, a valuable asset inside the cartel world. He continued feeding them select pieces of intelligence, just enough to keep their trust while keeping himself out of the spotlight. He played both sides flawlessly, rising to become one of the country's most notorious traffickers, all while staying ahead of those who were supposed to catch him. But in 1984, everything changed. The Florida-based smuggling gang Rick had worked with in his early days got busted. Federal agents swooped in, arresting 15 people, including Rick. He was transported to Florida to stand trial for his role in their smuggling operations. In court, Rick did what he did best. He played the game. He admitted to working with the gang but spun it in his favor, claiming he did it as part of his cooperation with the DEA. His goal, he said, was to provide them with insider information about drug smuggling operations in the country. It was a long shot, but incredibly, it worked. The DEA agents who believed in him even testified in his defense. But Rick had another problem, one that terrified him far more than the courtroom. He feared the Colombian cartels would see his trial and testimony as a betrayal. If they thought he was a traitor, they wouldn't hesitate to silence him. So, to maintain his credibility, he continued smuggling even while standing trial. On weekends, when court wasn't in session, he was back in the skies, running operations. Over the course of the 11-week trial, he completed 11 smuggling trips, earning an astonishing $13 million, all while sitting in court, pretending to be a mere pawn. And then came the final twist. Rick was the only defendant acquitted. His DEA connections had saved him. While the others faced heavy sentences, he walked free, richer than ever. But with great wealth came the challenge of hiding it. He turned to Michael Coffey, a banking expert, to launder his money through offshore accounts, ensuring that his fortune remained untouchable. However, the operation took a devastating hit when one of his pilots, Jim Cooper, made a fatal mistake. On a routine delivery, Jim landed at a secret airstrip where a local drug dealer was waiting to receive the shipment. But in a careless blunder, the dealer parked his car on the runway. Jim's plane, unable to stop in time, crashed into the vehicle, killing the dealer on the spot. The crash drew the attention of law enforcement, and when officers arrived, they discovered the shipment. Jim was arrested, now facing both drug smuggling charges and an unintentional murder charge. Rick received a desperate call from Jim, who was panicking over the situation. Instead of reassuring his pilot or finding a way to help, Rick made a cold decision. He cut all ties and abandoned Jim completely. Feeling betrayed and facing a possible 30 to 40-year prison sentence, Jim decided to save himself. He struck a deal with authorities, offering them everything he knew about Rick's operations in exchange for immunity. With Jim's confessions, law enforcement zeroed in on Rick and his company, Air America. But they needed more than just testimony to bring him down. A massive investigation was launched, tracking invoices, communications, flight records, and offshore accounts. Rick knew they were closing in. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. Anticipating his downfall, Rick acted fast. He transferred $30 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, believing that the lack of an extradition treaty would keep him safe. Then he fled there, thinking he had outplayed the system once again. But he had miscalculated. U.S. authorities tracked his money trail and alerted the Cayman Islands government. Despite no formal extradition agreement, local officials viewed Rick as a troublemaker they didn't want on their soil. In 1986, they arrested him and handed him over to the U.S. back on American soil. The charges against Rick were overwhelming: multiple counts of smuggling, conspiracy, and financial crimes. If convicted, he faced up to 345 years in prison. Realizing he had no way out, Rick made one final move to save himself. He agreed to cooperate, revealing the location of over $21 million in hidden cash and giving authorities a complete breakdown of his operations. In exchange for his full confession, his sentence was dramatically reduced to just 8.5 years. It was an astonishing outcome. One of the biggest smugglers in American history, responsible for transporting hundreds of millions of dollars worth of drugs, had gotten off with less than a decade behind bars. But there was one thing Rick never fully disclosed, where the rest of his fortune was hidden. And when he walked out of prison, he knew exactly where to find it. The DEA had gotten what they wanted: insider knowledge of cartel operations that was far more valuable to them than keeping Rick locked up for life. And with that, his story came to an end. Or did it? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe Robbery Mysteries for more interesting videos.